The Legend of the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. In a spacious cove on the eastern shore of the Hudson River sits a rural port officially called Greenburg, but more commonly known as Tarrytown. Not far from this village, perhaps about 2 miles, there is a little valley, which is one of the quietest places in the whole world. A small brook glides through it, with just murmur enough to lull one to sleep, and the occasional whistle of a quail or tapping of a woodpecker is almost the only sound that ever breaks in upon the uniform tranquility. This place, thanks to the dreamy influence that seems to hang over the land, has long been known by the name of Sleepy Hollow. Some say a German doctor bewitched the place during the early days of the settlement. Others say that an old Indian chief, a prophet or a wizard of his tribe, has put the good people of Sleepy Hollow under a spell, causing them to walk in a continual dreamlike state. To be sure, the inhabitants of Sleepy Hollow are often subject to trances and visions, and frequently to see strange sights and hear music and voices in the air. The whole neighborhood abounds with local tales and haunted spots and twilight superstitions. Stars shoot and meteors glare oftener across the valley than in other parts of the country. The dominant spirit, however, that haunts this enchanted region is the apparition of a figure on horseback without a head. It is said by some to be the ghost of a soldier whose head had been carried away by a cannonball in some nameless battle during the Revolutionary War, and is forever seen by the country folk hurrying along in the gloom of night as if floating on the wind. His haunts are not confined to the valley, but extend at times to the adjacent roads and especially to the vicinity of a distant church. Indeed, some of the most trusted historians of those parts allege that the body of the soldier is buried in the churchyard, and the ghost spends his nights riding to and from the scene of that ill-fated battle in a quest to find a head to replace the one he lost. Often he can be seen rushing along the hollow like a midnight blast, hurrying to get back to the churchyard before daybreak. He is known in fireside stories and whispered tones throughout the valley as the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. In this never-changing sleepy town, a schoolmaster named Ichabod Crane lived for a time. Crane was an apt name for the man, tall and lanky as he was, with narrow shoulders, long arms and legs, and hands that dangled a mile out of his sleeves, feet that might have served for shovels, and his whole frame most loosely hung together. His head was small and flat at top, with huge ears, large green glassy eyes, and a long nose. To see him striding along the road on a windy day with his clothes bagging and fluttering about him, one might have mistaken him for some scarecrow escaped from a cornfield. His schoolhouse was a low building, just one large room, rudely constructed of logs, the windows sporting holes patched with the pages of old notebooks. It stood in a rather lonely but pleasant location, just at the foot of a woody hill, with a brook running close by and a birch tree growing at one end of it. The low murmur of the students' voices might be heard there on a drowsy summer's day, like the hum of a beehive, interrupted now and then by the authoritative voice of the teacher. But when school hours were over, Crane might even be the companion and playmate of the larger boys, and on holiday afternoons would walk some of the smaller ones home, those who happened to have pretty sisters, or good housewives for mothers, noted for their talents in the kitchen. Indeed, it benefited him to keep on good terms with his students. The pay for a teacher was small and would have been barely sufficient to keep him fed, for although a skinny man, he ate a lot. So he stayed, according to country custom in those parts, at the houses of the farmers whose children he instructed. With these families he lived a week at a time, going the rounds of the neighborhood with his meager worldly goods tied up in a cotton sheet. To make up for the burden of his large appetite to those families that would, no doubt, feel the strain of having to house and feed yet another body, even if only for 1 week at a time, the teacher had ways of appearing both useful and agreeable. He would occasionally help the farmers with the lighter jobs on the farm, making hay, mending fences, cutting wood for winter fires, and at the schoolhouse he ruled over his little empire sternly, but was able to lay that aside in the home of his hosts and become wonderfully gentle and charming. He found favor in the eyes of the mothers by pampering the children, particularly the youngest, and with a smile would sit with a child on one leg while he rocked a cradle with the other for hours at a time. It benefited Crane to be a man of many talents, not the least of which was singing. This was something he gladly demonstrated on Sundays as he took his place at the front of the church, with a band of chosen accompanists, and where, in his own mind, he earned the admiration of all those around him, or at least he indulged himself in believing all the women. For the school teacher is generally a man of some importance among the women in places such as Sleepy Hollow, being considered a person of gentlemanlike manner with vastly superior tastes and accomplishments than those of the rough country locals. Oh, how smug he was as he walked, flanked on all sides by women, along the banks of the mill pond, as the sheepish country bumpkins stood back, envying him. From his transient life, he was also a kind of traveling newsman, carrying a load of local gossip from house to house, so that his appearance was always greeted with a certain amount of excitement and anticipation. Moreover, he could keep his hosts entertained by perfectly reciting Cotton Mather's History of New England Witchcraft, in which, by the way, he most firmly believed. He was, in fact, as interested in the extraordinary as one could be, and his residence in this spellbound region only served to increase his appetite for the macabre. No tale was too monstrous, too grotesque for his liking. He could often be found, once he had dismissed school, lying stretched in the clover bed by the schoolhouse, reading Mather's direful tales until the setting sun made it impossible to read any more. Then, as he made his way past swamp and stream and dense woodland back to the farmhouse he happened to be staying at that week, every sound in the gathering dusk only further fueled his excited imagination. At that witching hour, The moan of whip-poor-will from the hillside, the boding cry of the tree frog, the dreary hoot of the owl, or the sudden rustling of birds in the thicket would make his heart flutter with a thrill. The fireflies, too, which sparkled most vividly in the darkest places, startled him now and then, and if by chance a huge blockhead of a beetle came winging his blundering flight against him, the poor crane was ready to give up the ghost, with the idea that surely he had just been struck by a witch's cane. His only rescue to drown such thoughts or drive away the evil spirits was to sing aloud, and the good people of Sleepy Hollow, as he passed by their doors of an evening, would often hear his nasal melody floating from the distant hill or along the dusky road. And in winter evenings, Crane passed the time with the old country wives as they sat spinning wool by the fire, listening to their marvelous tales of ghosts and goblins, haunted fields and haunted brooks, haunted bridges and haunted houses, and particularly of the Headless Horseman. And he would delight the wives equally with his stories of New England witchcraft and of the direful omens and eerie sights and sounds in the air. But while Crane took pleasure in the telling of these tales in front of crackling fires and the agreeable company of old women, where no shadowy corner dare hide a phantom spirit, his joy of the evening was quickly dissolved by the terror of walking home alone later that night. Every shadow became a fearful shape. Every glare of the snowy night seemed grim and ghastly. Snow-covered shrubs became sheet-covered ghosts, and his own footsteps crackling on the frozen earth were mistaken for the sound of someone sneaking up behind him. Every howl of the wind in the trees, every whoosh of a passing cold blast was sure to be a signal that the Headless Horseman was now upon him. These, however, were terrors that came alive only in the night. These phantoms walked only in darkness, and though Crane most fully believed in the devilish sights and sounds of midnight, daylight brought with it a pleasant and refreshingly ghoul-free existence, one that Crane would have been most happy to subsist in, had his path not been crossed by a being that mystified him more than any ghost, goblin, or whole race of witches put together. And this was something that existed in the carefree daylight hours. This was a woman. Katrina Van Tassel was the daughter and only child of a well-known farmer, young and popular and pretty as a peach, stylish and spirited. She was destined for great things, and all those around her knew it, including one Ichabod Crane. Crane had the great luck of being Katrina's music teacher, and so had reason to visit her often at her father's mansion. The grounds of the Van Tassel family farm were impressive, nestled by the Hudson River and stocked well with fields of wheat and corn, orchards dripping with fruit, and barnyards full to the brim with plump, plentiful animals. Ichabod could fairly see himself living as the master of this fine property and the husband of the woman that would stand to inherit it all, Katrina Van Tassel. His heart yearned for her, danced at the thought of the family he might have with her, and though he could fairly burst with the daydream of a life he so completely and thoroughly composed for them, his quest for Katrina's affections would be much more difficult to secure in real life. For Ichabod Crane was not the only of Katrina's admirers. Not surprisingly, she had almost an entire army of suitors that Crane had to compete with. And while he could discount the scores of rough country boys practically jumping over one another to get to her, there was one person that Crane considered a true adversary. Brom Van Brunt was exactly the kind of person you would not want to compete with in the arena of romance. He was handsome and capable, nicknamed Brom Bones due to the crushing strength of him, and although he had a local reputation as a bit of a troublemaker, that seemed to only add to his charm and natural status as a leader. And much to Crane's annoyance, he too had pegged Katrina Van Tassel as the object of his affections. A weaker man may have bowed out of such a challenge, but Crane refused to even acknowledge the competition. While Brom Bones tried to impress Katrina with various acts of youthful chivalry and bravado, Crane advanced in a quieter manner. As Katrina's music teacher, Crane had good reason to be at Katrina's house on a regular basis. And while there, not only did he have the opportunity to charm his lovely muse, but also her parents. Eventually, Crane, with the trust of Katrina's adoring parents, was able to exchange his music lessons with Katrina for long walks through the orchards or afternoons spent under the shade of a nearby elm. Crane would not even acknowledge Brom Bones as a rival for Katrina's heart. And Brom, understanding finally that Crane was not to give up his quest for Katrina, would not openly spar for her affections with a stubborn schoolmaster. No, Brom preferred a much more sneaky approach to beating Crane in the race for Katrina's hand. It was thus that Crane found himself the victim of 1,000 petty humiliations at the hands of Brom or one of his friends. Whether discovering himself locked out of his own schoolhouse in the morning or finding the schoolhouse itself vandalized and topsy-turvy, poor Ichabod became the butt of endless practical jokes implemented by that bully Brom Bones. But the very worst of the ridicule was saved for when Katrina was present, and Brom, he spared no opportunity to embarrass the schoolteacher in front of her. In fact, no one will soon forget the Sunday service that saw Crane in his usual place at the front of the church, where he smiled gently at Katrina in her family's pew, then opened his mouth to sing the first note of his regular performance, and found himself competing in song with a warbled yowl of a dog outside the open window that Brom had taught to whine on command, and of course commanded the dog to begin at the exact moment that Ichabod was to begin too. Oh my, how that unfortunate choir is still talked about, with a chuckle, to this day. And so things went on like this for a time. Crane constantly on alert, yet constantly falling prey to Brom's pranks, and neither one of them seeming to advance much in their quest for Katrina's affection, until one day when the teacher's afternoon lesson was interrupted by an abrupt knock at the schoolhouse door. Normally this sort of disruption to his lessons would find Crane angered and agitated. But when he went to the door to confront the intruder, he had no time to utter a word before the messenger at the door thrust a note into his palm and was off. In his hand, Crane discovered, was an invitation to attend a party at none other than Mr. Van Tassels. And having been hand-delivered this important missive, Crane could think of nothing else for the remainder of the afternoon. He hurried through his lessons, letting go of his usual demand for silence. His students were quick to notice this rare lapse in focus and took great advantage of their situation, whispering and giggling, passing notes and making jokes. By mid-afternoon, Crane could barely handle his anticipation or his class, and he let them go early to much rowdy excitement. Crane spent the remainder of his afternoon preparing for the party, spending much more time than he usually did on his appearance, even making arrangements with his current host, a grumpy old farmer named Hans van Ripper, to borrow a horse so that Crane could make a respectful and stately entrance to the party. Unfortunately, the only horse the farmer would lend out was one even older and grumpier than he, a broken-down workhorse named Gunpowder. What a sight they made, the lanky, awkward Ichabod atop the cantankerous steed with only one good eye. Onward towards the Van Tassels they jogged, Ichabod's knees raised almost as high as his chest, thanks to the short length of the stirrups he was riding in, his pointy elbows jutting out sharply as he encouraged the old horse to trot in a dignified manner. It was a beautiful autumn day, with a clear, serene sky and a refreshing crispness to the air. Small birds sang as they gathered seeds for their farewell banquets, chirping as they fluttered from bush to bush and tree to tree, twittering blackbirds and golden-winged woodpeckers. Ichabod enjoyed it all. He inhaled deeply the scent of the apples hanging heavy from the trees, some gathered already into baskets, others heaped in piles ready for the cider house. Farther on, he passed great fields of corn, then pumpkins, then buckwheat, breathing in the odor of the beehives and making him dream of Saturday morning pancakes slathered in butter or syrup, prepared for him by the dimpled, soft hand of his Katrina Van Tassel. It was with such sweet thoughts in mind that Crane arrived at the estate of the Van Tassels, which he found abuzz with the arrival of many of the town's inhabitants. The men were dressed in their finest garments, and the women in even finer, arms laced through their daughters as they entered the grounds. But it was that Brom Bones, however, that was the hero of the scene, having come to the gathering on his favorite steed, Daredevil, a creature like himself, full of mettle and mischief, and which no one but himself could manage. He was in fact noted for preferring wild horses and quick to perform all kinds of tricks that kept the rider in constant risk of breaking his neck. Brom felt that a well-broken horse was unworthy of a lad of his spirit, though truth be told, Brom was little more than a show-off. But Ichabod's mood could not be tarnished by even this obnoxious performance. And as he entered the Van Tassels' house, there was a feast like no other. Tables laid full of platters upon platters of sliced ham and smoked beef, broiled fish and roasted chickens, not to mention the luxurious selection of cakes and pastries and cookies and pies and preserves and seemingly every last thing the autumn harvest could become in the hands and talents of the Dutch countryside cooks. Such a banquet deserves to be discussed and admired at great length. But luckily, our Ichabod Crane will help to move the story along by being not so much in a hurry to discuss the spread, but to eat it. And with every bite, Crane's good mood rose even further, and he could not help looking around him as he ate and chuckling with the possibility that he might one day be the keeper of all this splendor. But for now, this belonged not to Crane, but to old Baltus Van Tassel, who moved about his guests in good humor, round and jolly as the harvest moon. He implored his guests to enjoy themselves, to eat, 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 and nodding towards the sound of music coming from the common room, summoning his guests to dance. And dance Ichabod did, for he prided himself on his dancing almost as much as his singing, and when he danced, not a limb, not one part of him was still. He commanded quite an audience, and his fellow guests gathered to watch this joyous, animated form clattering around the room in full motion, and in his arms, why, it was the lady of his heart herself, smiling graciously in reply to all his amorous allusions, while that Brom Bones, Crane was satisfied to notice, sat brooding in a corner on his own, sorely smitten with love and jealousy. Regrettably, the dance eventually ended, and Crane had to relinquish his love to the crowd of people eager for her attentions. Crane made his own way through the party until he was attracted to a group of the older folks who, with old Van Tassel, sat gossiping about former times, drawing out long stories of the war. There were stories of triumph and of defeat, of great misadventure and great mischief, the latter eliciting gales of laughter from both the storyteller and his audience. There were tales of soldiers that had exhibited shows of the greatest skills and bravery in combat, and those that had to rely on little more than luck to get them through. The stories turned to that of a doomed Major Andre, who, it was said, had been captured in front of an enormous tulip tree that still stood in the center of the road, towering like a giant above all the other trees of the neighborhood, forming a kind of landmark. Its limbs were gnarled and fantastic, large enough to form trunks for ordinary trees, twisting down almost to the earth and rising again into the air. The tree was universally known by the name of Major Andre's tree, and the people of Sleepy Hollow regarded it with a mixture of respect and superstition, partly out of sympathy for the fate of its ill-starred namesake, and partly from the tales of strange sights and cries and wails that could be heard emanating from the spot where Major Andre had been taken. Some mention was made also of the woman in white that haunted the dark glen at Raven Rock, and was often heard to shriek on winter nights before a storm, having perished there in the snow. But the chief subject of these spooky stories was the favorite of Sleepy Hollow, the Headless Horseman, who, it seemed, had been heard from several times of late, patrolling the countryside, and it was said tethering his horse nightly among the graves in the churchyard. The churchyard, provided the perfect place for a ghost to roam, hidden almost from view by locust trees and lofty elms. To look upon its grass-grown yard, where the sunbeams seemed to sleep so quietly, one would think that there, at least, the dead might rest in peace. On one side of the church flows a brook, and not far from it was a wooden bridge thrown over it, the road leading to it and the bridge itself shaded by the overhanging trees that cast a gloomy pall over the place, even in the height of day, and helped it achieve a fearful darkness at night. It was here on the dark road leading to the church where the headless horseman was most frequently encountered. Even old man Brower, who otherwise disbelieved in such ghostly nonsense, told how he met the headless horseman one night on the road from Sleepy Hollow, and how he was forced to sit behind him on his horse as they galloped over hill and swamp until they reached the bridge, where the horseman suddenly stopped short and turned into a skeleton, throwing old Brower into the brook and galloping away with a clap of thunder. That story, however, was immediately trumped by Brom Bones, who told the crowd that, in his opinion, the headless horseman was no more than a heedless jockey. He claimed that one night upon returning from a neighboring village, he had been overtaken by the headless horseman, but once he realized who was chasing him, had raced his wild horse in earnest against the ghost horse, and would have won too, except that as soon as they came upon the church bridge, the headless horseman vanished in a flash of fire. Well, these stories sank deep into the mind of Ichabod, and in return, he recited large extracts from his invaluable author, Cotton Mather. He added tell of many marvelous events that had taken place in his native state of Connecticut, as well as the fearful sights which he had seen in his nightly walks about Sleepy Hollow. Eventually, the party broke up. Old farmers gathered their families in their wagons and rattled out towards the distant hills. Some of the younger women got onto the backs of the horses of the younger men, blushing with light-hearted laughter, and soon the house was quiet. Ichabod, however, lagged behind, anticipating the opportunity to finally have a moment alone with his Katrina, fully convinced that he was on the road to becoming her exclusive beau that very night. What passed at this interview I will not pretend to say, for in fact I do not know. Something, however, must have gone very wrong, for Ichabod soon left the house looking practically devastated. Oh, these women. From looking at him, one could see that he barely understood what had gone wrong. Was Katrina encouraging his attentions simply to attract the jealous eye of his arch-rival? Ichabod could not stand to imagine the image of Katrina's hand in Brom Bones's, and without looking at the great fields he once pictured as rightly his, he walked to the stable and roused his old steed for the lonely ride home. Off they strode, as dismal as the hour itself, along the roads above the river. In the dead hush of midnight, he heard the distant bark of a watchdog, or now and then the long-drawn crowing of a rooster, accidentally startled from sleep and unaware that it was not yet time to sound its alarm. The melancholy chirp of the crickets and the rasping hum of the bullfrogs in a nearby marsh accompanied him on the dark roads home. All the stories that he heard that evening of ghosts and goblins now came crowding back to his recollection. The night grew darker and darker, and the stars seemed to sink deeper in the sky. He had never felt so lonely and miserable. He was, moreover, approaching the place where many of the scenes of the ghost stories had taken place. In the center of the road stood the enormous tulip tree, its limbs gnarled and fantastic. It was here that Major Andre had been taken prisoner, and to quell his dread, Ichabod began to whistle. He was quite sure, however, that he had heard his whistle being answered, but was relieved to realize that it was in fact a blast of wind sweeping sharply through the dry branches. Suddenly, he heard a groan. His teeth chattered. He lowered himself fearfully in the saddle, but it was just the rubbing of one huge bough upon another as they were swayed about by the breeze. He passed the tree in safety, but new perils lay before him. About 200 yards from the tree, a small brook crossed the road and ran into a marshy and thickly wooded glen known by the name of Wily Swamp. A few rough logs laid side by side served for a bridge over this stream. A dense group of oak and chestnut trees, matted thick with wild grapevines, threw a cavernous gloom over the area. To pass over this rickety bridge was the severest of trial, not to mention the fact that it was at this identical spot that the soldiers who captured Andre had hidden until they could attack the unfortunate major. This has ever since been considered a haunted stream, and fearful are those who have to pass it alone after dark. As he approached the stream, Ichabod's heart began to thump. He summoned all his courage, took a deep breath, and gave his horse half a jolt to the ribs as he attempted to dash quick as he could across the bridge. But instead of moving forward, the startled old horse turned sideways and knocked straight into a fence. Ichabod, whose fears increased with the delay, jerked the reins to the other side and urged his steed to move. But it was all in vain. Oh, his horse moved, it is true, but only to plunge to the opposite side of the road into a thicket of brambles and bushes. The schoolmaster tried desperately to write Gunpowder, who dashed forward, snuffling and snorting, but came to a jarring halt at the foot of the log bridge with a suddenness that had nearly sent his rider sprawling over his head. Just at this moment, a marshy, stomping sound by the side of the bridge caught Ichabod's sensitive ear. In the dark shadow of the grove, on the edge of the brook, he saw something huge, misshapen, and towering. It did not move forward, but seemed to grow larger in the gloom, like some gigantic monster ready to spring upon the traveler. The hair on Ichabod's head, it stood straight up in terror. He knew that it was too late to try to get his horse to turn and run. And besides, what chance could there possibly be of escaping this goblin, if that indeed is what it was? He therefore summoned up all of his courage and demanded in an unsteady voice, Who are you?" But he received no reply. Terror-stricken, he dug his heels most desperately into Gunpowder's sides, and shutting his eyes, they blasted forward past the ghost. Oh, the shadowy object also moved, and with one bound appeared in the middle of the road, just ahead of the spot that Ichabod and Gunpowder barreled towards. Ichabod opened his eyes and gazed upon the stranger. He was a horseman of exceedingly large dimensions, mounted on a powerful black horse. As Ichabod approached, the horseman made no acknowledgement of him, but moved to one side of the road, galloping easily in pace on the blind side of old Gunpowder, who was moving at a speed he had probably not reached in many years. Ichabod thought back to Brombones' story of outrunning the midnight horseman, and thought that he should try to do the same. The strange rider beside him, however, kept an equal pace. Ichabod pulled up and fell into a walk, thinking to get behind him. But the other rider did the same, and soon they were walking side by side again, cloaked in an eerie silence. His heart sinking, Ichabod dared to look up at his mysterious companion, whose shadow loomed in the glow of the full moon behind him. It was then that Ichabod's horror was truly realized, for in silhouette, Crane could clearly see that this giant horseman indeed was headless. Oh, his terror rose to desperation when he realized that the head that should have rested on his shoulders was in fact sitting in his lap on the saddle. Crane kicked, and he prodded Gunpowder with all his might, hoping that the sudden run would give his companion the slip, but the headless rider was ready, his horse rearing up menacingly on hind legs, his front legs kicking high into the air before giving chase. Away they dashed through thick and thin, stones flying and sparks flashing at every bound. They had now reached the road which turns off to Sleepy Hollow, but Gunpowder, instead of keeping upon it, made an opposite turn and plunged headlong downhill to the left, to a road leading through trees for about a quarter of a mile, where it finally crosses the bridge the rider is said not to be able to pass, and just beyond which swells the green knoll and the old whitewashed church upon it. Gunpowder's unpredictable turn had given Ichabod a momentary advantage in the chase, but the horse's vigor was causing the saddle to slip out from under him. He tried to hold on to it, but the jostling beneath him was too much, and he had just enough time to grasp Gunpowder tightly around the neck before it tumbled to the ground. Oh, he immediately heard it being trampled by his pursuer. In a moment of absurd terror, Ichabod had a flash of Hans von Ripper's ire at being out a saddle. Oh, but this was no time for petty fears, as the demon rider was close behind, and Ichabod had to concentrate with all his might just to stay on Gunpowder's back. They headed toward a clearing now in the trees, and Ichabod gained a moment of temporary relief when he saw that just beyond it lay the church bridge. He knew from the stories that the horseman somehow was not able to cross the bridge, that this was the border between terror and hope, and that if he could just cross that bridge, he would be safe. Just then, He heard the great black steed approaching, and was sure he felt the demon horse's hot breath on his neck. It was all the incentive he needed to roust old Gunpowder with a jolt to the ribs, and the horse sprang, thundering over the planks of the bridge. He reached the other side and quickly looked behind to see if the headless horseman would, according to the rule, vanish in a flash of fire and brimstone. But what he saw instead was the horseman rising in his stirrups, heaving its head from its place in his lap and hurtling it like a missile straight at Ichabod. Oh, he tried to dodge the horrible shot, but it was too late. It hit him square in the forehead with a tremendous crash, and he realized that he was tumbling down into the dust, just as his vision of Gunpowder, the horseman, and the world went black. The next morning, the old horse was found, calmly eating the grass at Van Ripper's gate, missing both his saddle and the rider that was supposed to have been in it. Ichabod did not make an appearance at breakfast, nor did he show up to open the schoolhouse. The students were at first rowdy and excited when the appearance of the schoolteacher was delayed. But eventually the children wandered away, confused at not going about their usual routine. When the dinner hour came, and there was still no sign of Ichabod, Hans Van Ripper began to feel some uneasiness about the fate of poor Ichabod and his saddle. A search party was sent out on foot, and after diligent investigation, they came upon a strange sight on the road leading to the old church. The saddle was found, trampled in the dirt. The tracks of horses' hoofs, deeply dented in the road, were followed to the bridge, beyond which, on the bank of the brook where the water ran deep and black, was found Ichabod's hat, and close beside it, a shattered pumpkin. Oh, the brook was searched, but Ichabod's body was never found. Hans Van Ripper examined the bundle of belongings that Ichabod had left, finding that his worldly effects consisted of 2 shirts, 2 ties, a pair of socks, a rusty razor, a dog-eared book of music, and a broken pitch pipe. Oh, there was also Crane's copy of Cotton Mather's History of Witchcraft, a New England almanac, and tucked inside a book about dreams and fortune-telling, a folded piece of paper upon which was scribbled a fruitless attempt at a love poem written for Katrina Van Tassel. The mysterious disappearance was the topic of all conversation throughout the town, and groups of gazers and gossips could be found at the churchyard, the bridge, and the brook, speculating on the events and offering their theories as to how things had played out that fateful night. The stories of Brower, Brombones, and a host of others were called to mind, and when they had diligently considered and compared them all, they could come to no conclusion other than Ichabod had indeed been carried off by the headless horseman. Ichabod was a bachelor, And as he was in nobody's debt, after a while nobody troubled themselves, wondering about his fate. Soon a new schoolteacher arrived to take his place. Several years later, an old farmer, upon returning from a trip to New York City, brought home word that Ichabod Crane was alive and well, that he had left Sleepy Hollow that night, partly out of fear of both the goblin and Hans von Ripper, and partly out of humiliation at having been suddenly dismissed by Katrina van Tassel. It was said that he had moved to a distant part of the country where he had taught school and studied law at the same time, been admitted to the Law Society, turned politician, was elected office, wrote for newspapers, and had finally been made judge in a city court. Brom Bones, too, who shortly after his rival's disappearance triumphantly married the lovely Katrina. He was said to look exceedingly knowingly whenever the story of Ichabod Crane came up, and always did he burst into a hearty laugh at the mention of the pumpkin, which led some to suspect that he knew more of the matter than he was letting on. But it is the old country wives who are the best judges of these matters, and they maintain to this day that Ichabod had been spirited away by the Headless Horseman. The story of Ichabod Crane and the Headless Horseman is a favorite, often told throughout the neighborhood on dark winter nights as the fires blazed warm. The bridge became more than ever an object of superstitious awe. And perhaps that is why the road has been altered in years of late, so as to approach the old whitewashed church from the other side, bypassing the brook altogether. The schoolhouse was eventually deserted for a larger, newer institution, and soon after fell into decay. It is reported to be haunted, the story going that if you venture there on a still summer evening, you can hear the schoolteacher coming up the road, chanting a melancholy tune as he mourned his unfortunate fate in the tranquil solitude of Sleepy